Welcome to part 2 of our Riparian video series. Here we will dive into specific native and invasive plants that live along Johnson Creek.
So, before we get into talking about some of the common riparian trees, shrubs, and ground covers that we might find, I want to talk a little bit about native plants versus invasive plants and kind of define what those are. So native plants are those plants that have been in this area since time immemorial. They evolved here, have been growing here for many, many thousands of years, and so they are kind of endemic to this area. It's important to have native vegetation because most of the native wildlife have co-evolved with that vegetation, with those trees and shrubs and ground cover plants. So, for example, most insect species are specialists on a particular plant or a small group of plants that are related to each other for some part of their life. It's the only plant they'll lay eggs on. It's the only plant they'll eat. It's the only plant their larvae eat. Something like that. So something like 90% of insect species have that very tight relationship with a particular plant. So in order to have a native diversity of insect species, you need a native diversity of plant species. Why do we care about bugs? Icky, slot, bite, What do birds eat? 96% of terrestrial birds feed their young on insects, so they're bringing bugs back to the nests. If the bugs aren't there, the birds aren't there. If the birds aren't there, the coyotes aren't there, and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit about the importance of native plants. Invasive plants are a subset of non-native plants. So there are non-native plants that are perfectly fine. The roses you grow in your yard, the cultivated peonies are not a problem at all. They're lovely plants. They just don't happen to be native to here. But there's a small subset of non-native plants that are considered invasive, that grow very, very far too well in this area. Partly because of the climate, partly because maybe they don't have the pests and diseases here that they have in the places where they came from. And so as a result of that, they grow very, very rapidly to the cost of native species. And this is where the real problem comes in with them. I don't begrudge them just growing, but they're growing at the expense of plants that have adapted to this area and that provide food. Let's talk about some specific native trees and shrubs in this area. I am holding a leaf from one such tree. This tree, you'll be unsurprised to know, is called big leaf maple. As you can tell from the fact that it covers my face, it has very large leaves. You can see the leaves on the actual tree up here. So big leaf maple is a pretty easy one to identify. You'll notice, perhaps, this isn't going to work. This is going to work. So all of the branches on the big leaf maple kind of come out in pairs. See how there's sort of a pair there that are right across from each other on the stem? That's an orientation called opposite. And so that's one of the ways that you can identify what plant you have is looking at how the leaves are on the stem. Are they opposite, like this, where they come out in pairs, or are they alternate, like these leaves? So you have one out here, and then one out here, one out here, one out here. So they're, rather than pairs, they're kind of staggered along the branch. So that's an orientation called alternate. And so knowing whether you've got alternate leaves versus opposite is one way to tell plants apart. So you've seen the big leaf maple. What we were just looking at, these alternate leaves, is another riparian tree called red alder. Red alder is a very important tree in riparian areas. And the reason for it is, well, one, it grows very, very fast. It grows very easily in disturbed areas, like areas that flood frequently, which riparian areas do. And, importantly, it has a little bacterium that lives on its roots that can take nitrogen out of the air and fix it, put it into a form that makes it usable for other plants. So it's basically putting fertilizer into the soil. Because it does that, alder leaves don't change color in fall the way most leaves do. Because alder trees, knowing that they have this source of nitrogen for themselves, don't bother taking all of their goodies back in from the leaves, which is what causes the color change in fall. So alder drop their leaves green. Many of those leaves end up in the stream and provide up to a third of the nitrogen inputs to streams in the Pacific Northwest. So all of that nutrient value is then available for the macroinvertebrates to eat. So alders are a super important riparian tree. We've got another super important riparian tree over here. This big fella is called Western Red Cedar. All these branches are leafless. But we can look at the bark for the moment. We'll get you a close-up on the leaves in a sec. But take a look at this bark. If you put your finger on one strand of bark and start running up, it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. So that's one of the ways you know you've got a Western Red Cedar on your hands, is these big long strips, which are used by Native American peoples traditionally for all kinds of different things, including they made diapers out of them at one point. The reason you can do that is, unlike most trees, I can rub my hand up and down on this and I will never get a splinter from a Western Red Cedar. So that's another way you know you've got cedar in your hands. Let's get a look at cedar leaves somehow. Here we go. And I say leaves, they are leaves. They don't look like them. Some people call them scales because they look a little scaly. These are a kind of modified needle. Cedars are one of our evergreen trees, or conifers. And so these particular ones, instead of needles, have these kind of scaly looking things. And the way, this is a poor example. Yeah, you don't really see the butterflies on these. How about this? Yeah, that's a little better. I don't know if you'll be able to see this or not, but if you look very closely at the undersides of these scales, you can see there's a little kind of lighter green to white pattern that looks a little bit like a butterfly's wings splayed out. And so if you've got a butterfly pattern on the underside, that's another telltale sign that it's Western Red Cedar, as opposed to some of the other species that look sort of like it. One more tree to introduce you to that we see. This is often more of an upland tree because it likes things a little drier, but we do have one down here in the riparian area. And that is Oregon's state tree, which is the Douglas fir. So Douglas fir has these big, craggy, hunky bark hunks. And when they get really, really big, bats will actually roost in the grooves in between these pieces of bark. So they're a very important habitat tree for a wide variety of things, including our little brown bats that fly around. So that's some important riparian trees. So we talked about some riparian trees. Let's meet some riparian shrubs. Here's a really common one called Indian plum, also sometimes called osoberry. So it's got really kind of very bright green leaves. It's one of the very first shrubs to leaf out and flower in the springtime. In fact, the flowers often come out before the leaves do. So it's a very important pollinator plant because it's got flowers on it very early. This is also a great example of, we talked a little bit about opposite versus alternate leaves. So you can see that these leaves are alternate. There's one coming off there, there's one coming off there, there's one coming off there, there's one coming off there. Another important distinction between leaf types is simple versus compound. These are simple leaves, where you've just got one leaf coming off on a short stalk, called a petiole. So just that one leaf is all in one piece. We'll learn about compound leaves on a couple of other shrubs that we'll look at in a minute. But Indian plum is a simple, alternate leaf structure. So one leaf staggered across the stem. Pretty white flowers. They get pollinated and form tiny little plum-like fruits that actually go through the whole rainbow over the course of their ripening. They start off green, and then they turn yellow, and then orange, and then red, and then finally when they're fully ripe, they're a deep purpley blue, almost black color. So they're very fun to watch through the seasons as they change color. Right next to our Indian plum, we have another very common riparian shrub called a red osier dogwood, or red twig dogwood. So that's a super important riparian shrub. Big, complex root system that's very good at doing that bank erosion control, soil stability thing that we talked about. Dogwoods are, as you might be able to see, an opposite leaf orientation. See, again, we have these pairs of leaves coming off from the same point on the stem. Here's a pair, here's a pair, and here's a pair out at the end. These are another simple-leaved shrub. So you can, here's your petiole, and then you've just got one simple leaf. No fanciness about it. These are very important deer browse in the wintertime. So deer really like to chew on the smaller branches of this. Beavers are also big fans of red osier dogwood. They love chewing pieces off and stashing them away to be able to eat during the winter. So that's your red osier dogwood. Let's wander over into the other parts of the riparian area and meet a couple of other important shrubs. So, we've learned about a whole bunch of different really cool native plants that grow in riparian areas. We should probably learn a little bit about some of the invasive ones too, so that you know what to look for and what problems they can cause. Let's start with one that is pretty common in riparian areas because they tend to be kind of wet and a little bit squishy, and that's the sort of thing it likes. These pretty little yellow flowers belong to a plant called creeping buttercup. So creeping buttercup has these leaves that have these little kind of very pale green to almost white dots right at the bases of the where the lobes come out, where the leaf kind of separates a little bit. That was not a shining example. Here, look at this one maybe. So you see those kind of pale blotches on the leaves. That's a real distinctive feature of the creeping buttercup. And that's similar to most invasives. It's a rhizomatous thing, so it creeps out with roots underground and just kind of takes over these sort of wet areas. It's a pain to remove this stuff. Because any little broken off fragment of root can regrow into a new plant. So, yeah, it's just a straight blood, sweat, and tears approach to invasives removal to get rid of invasive creeping buttercup. Speaking of blood, here is Armenian blackberry. Similar looking leaves to the salmonberry, and which makes sense because they're both in the same genus. The Armenian blackberry is just, as the name implies, imported from elsewhere. and is very, very good at growing in the Pacific Northwest. If you have ever driven a road that is not in downtown Portland, you have probably driven by Himalayan blackberry. The leaflets are a little more rounded on the Himalayan blackberry than they are on the salmonberry. They sort of do the butterfly thing on some of the younger leaves, but again, it's much more rounded versus the more pointy. Big, gnarly. These thorns aren't that big because this plant is young, but that would still, you know, it'd take a chunk of flesh off of you if you treated it the wrong way. So blackberry is another one that spreads both by roots and also by birds eating the fruits and pooping them out. The fruits are delicious, not gonna lie. But in fact, that's why this was developed in the first place. This was a Luther Burbank creation of Burbank Seed Company fame, who wanted an easy-to-grow blackberry variety for the kitchen garden. Check on easy to grow. So this is kind of the scourge of ecological restoration work in the west of the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest. We spend a lot of time digging this stuff out. Let's come around and have a look at, I already talked some about English ivy. I just wanted to give you a close-up of what that actually looks like. So, underneath all of the blackberry and other stuff here, I'm looking for a good solid vine of this stuff, and I'm not finding it. It's all little dribsy-drabsy stuff. Yeah, anyhow. Let's just take a close-up at the leaves. Not a plant you're apt to confuse with much of anything. Really glossy, kind of three-pointed sometimes, kind of five-pointed sometimes, and then when they climb up trees, they look totally different. They get all kind of egg-shaped. Yeah, really common invasive plant in this area. Grows up trees, spreads along the ground, and generally does not play well with others. Similar sort of not playing well with others and vining. Another plant that we mentioned before is this here, which is a wild clematis. There are ornamental clematises that are perfectly well behaved, that have big showy flowers that people grow up trellises in their yards. No issue with those. This is a different animal. It's related. It's in the same genus, in Clematis. But the flowers are not particularly showy. They're kind of these puffy, white, cotton ball looking sort of things that come out in late summer. It's all over the place because those puffy white flowers turn into puffy white seed pods that are composed of dozens to hundreds of individual little seeds with these little white sort of tails that blow around in the wind and find their way into every crack and crevice where a thing can go and manage to grow there. So clematis is a good example of something with opposite compound leaves. Here's a leaf. This is the whole leaf, or these are leaflets, and they're coming out in pairs. And clematis, as you see, is real good at climbing. That's kind of its jam. This will completely smother trees if left to its own devices. So this is another one we spend a lot of time fighting with.
Currently, many of the riparian areas along Johnson Creek are being impacted by urbanization and are under lots of stress. These stressors can be a lot of things, such as oil from cars, impermeable surfaces, trash thrown into the creek, erosion, and many other factors. There are a lot of directions we can take to mitigate against these impacts, but can you take a guess at what might be the most effective and easiest way based on what we learned earlier? Planting. Planting native trees and shrubs is one really important step we can take in order to keep our riparian areas healthy. Like Noah mentioned before, plants can provide shade for the creek, reduce erosion, filtrate pollutants, provide habitat, food, and refuge for wildlife, and so much more. Check out what organizations in your area are hosting planting parties along riparian areas.
Thank you for watching our riparian video shot here at Leach Botanical Gardens. I hope you will join us on a field trip where we can do some riparian observations sometime soon. You might even see plastic flamingos while you're